Every so often I look at the news, and sometimes I like to comment on it. Usually only to my friends. Rarely do I comment about the news on YouTube. But back in March, I started following a news story online. Ebola. And now I would like to comment on it. This is Adrienne Floreen, Comments on the News. And I'm Adrienne Floreen, an independent investigative reporter and an activist. I live in Humboldt County, California, with my family and my cats. Like this one. This is Survivor. Survivor's eyes look kind of runny because they are runny. They're infected. Survivor is named Survivor because she nearly died of an infectious disease. I took her to the vet today, and I paid them $160 to do a laboratory test to determine what the disease is. Because many of my cats have become infected, and several of them have had to go to the emergency vet because they were deathly ill.
It burns so much.
So let's talk about Ebola in America. At this point, the Ebola virus is uncontained in Texas. It's on the loose. There's a possibility that it's on the loose. I'm looking at the news right now. And I'm seeing some scary news.
But occasionally, I want to talk about me.
They think that a homeless man might have been exposed to Ebola. If Ebola got into the homeless population, that would be a worst-case scenario, because homeless people aren't necessarily going to be easy to track. They're not necessarily going to want to tell the government who they came into contact with, or where they went to the bathroom, or who they shared needles with or sold drugs to. And now I'm looking at the news and I'm seeing that school children in Dallas may have been exposed to Ebola. That brings up a really good point. Why would anybody send their child to school if their child was sick with a possibly contagious disease? Well, that's because most schools have a rule that children only get a limited number of sick days, and if they miss more days than that, they can be held back and forced to repeat the grade, or their parents can even get in trouble with the law. So parents are forced to send their kids to school when they're sick and possibly infectious. Businesses also have similar rules for their employees. They're only allowed to miss a certain number of days of work. If they miss more, they might lose their job. To stop the spread of the Ebola outbreak, or to stop the spread of the enterovirus outbreak, or to stop the spread of the swine flu outbreak, or to stop the spread of any other disease outbreak that's contagious from one person to another, we need to pass a law that requires people to stay home from work and school when they're sick, and that makes it illegal for a boss to fire an employee for missing work when they're sick from a contagious disease, or for a child to get in trouble in school for missing too much school if they're sick from a contagious disease. This is the only way to stop the spread of diseases like Ebola and enterovirus and swine flu. Basically, Ebola is loose in Texas right now. And apparently, Ebola is also loose in Spain, because one of these nurses who is treating a patient in Spain is now infected. They're saying that the nurses and doctors get it when they're taking off their gloves. They contaminate themselves when they take off their gloves. Because think about it, if you have gloves on, when you go to take them off, sometimes your fingers might go under, or you might touch your skin, or microscopic particles on the gloves might fly off onto your skin. So even though they're in all this protective gear, when they take it off, they're at risk of contaminating themselves. I'm looking at an article that was written July 29th, 2014, and it's called Ebola's Escape from Africa Unlikely, Though Not Impossible. See, even in July...
How is it unlikely?
Well, that's what I said. The minute I heard there was an Ebola outbreak in one of the largest cities in Africa, I knew almost for sure that it was going to escape from Africa. How can they say it's not likely? It's propaganda to keep people from being afraid and panicking. If they said Ebola is certainly going to spread out of Africa, people would panic. The Ebola outbreak was first in the news in March when just over 50 people were infected. That's when I first saw it in the news. And when I first saw it in the news, I thought, I bet it's going to spread around the world. because I had just watched a documentary about that city in Africa and about how overpopulated it was and about how bad the sanitation was and about how other diseases were spreading there. So what if somebody goes to the hospital and they have Ebola and the hospital says, you just have a normal cold, take these antibiotics and go home. And they go to the grocery store and they look at all the different cold medicines trying to decide which one to take, and they touch all of them. All of those bottles of cold medicine are now infected with Ebola. And then 100 other people with a cold go to the store to buy some cold medicine. And now they're infected with Ebola because they touched the bottle. And then they get sick and they think they're just getting a really bad cold. And they go to the doctor or the hospital and they say, I'm getting a really bad cold. And the doctor at the hospital says, have you been to Africa recently? And they say no. And the doctor says, take some cold medicine and go home. Or take these antibiotics. That could really cause a problem. Actually, what the hospital did in Texas was just about as bad as that. They told him he had a normal cold and gave him antibiotics and sent him home. Even though he said he'd been to Liberia. But he didn't tell them that he'd actually carried somebody who was dying of Ebola to the hospital.
Wait, so...
He didn't tell them that he knew he was infected. He told that to his family, but not to the hospital. I think the guy came here to America on purpose because he knew he was infected with Ebola. Because they say he got it from taking someone to the hospital who was dying of Ebola. He took her to 4 different hospitals, and they refused to take her because they had too many patients already. So then he came to America. Well, he must have known he was infected, because he was around someone with Ebola. And he knew that if he went to the hospital in his country, they wouldn't be able to treat him because they already had too many patients. And he heard on the news about all these people were being evacuated to America and cured of Ebola. So he knew his only hope of being cured was to come to America. Before you leave Liberia or Guinea or Sierra Leone, you have to sign a piece of paper that swears you haven't been exposed to Ebola, to your knowledge. And he knew he'd been exposed, but he still said he hadn't. And then when he came to America, he didn't say, oh, I was around a woman who was dying of Ebola. He said, oh, I was in Liberia. He didn't even say he helped a woman. Oh. He said he wasn't around anyone who was sick. He just said he was in Liberia. So he didn't tell them the full story because he didn't want to get in trouble.
People will lie because they're trying to save themselves and they don't give a fuck about anybody else.
And that's how it spread to Nigeria. Someone did the same thing. It spread now to 2 whole other countries because one person went to the other country. One person went to the other country and they lied and said they hadn't been exposed.
It's just a cold that you're going to get over, but they'll hit the joint because...
Now let me put 2 and 2 together there. People will hit the joint when they're sick. The government, if they think you've been exposed to Ebola, they're going to try to find out everyone that you've been in contact with. And that includes if you smoke pot, if you've smoked out of a pipe, and it's touched your spit, and you hand it to someone else, the government's going to want to know the names of all of your buddies that you smoke marijuana with, and they're all going to have to be quarantined for 21 days, because they might have been exposed to Ebola. Now, how many people are going to say, yeah, how many people are going to say, oh yeah, I smoked pot with Jack and Jill and Joe over there, go to their house and send the feds over to quarantine them? I mean, can you really imagine a bunch of stoners telling agents from the federal government who they took bong hits with last night? How would you feel if the feds showed up at your door and wanted to quarantine you for 21 days because you took bong hits with somebody who may be infected with Ebola? Or would a prostitute want to tell the government who she'd had sex with last night? Or would she even know? Hopefully I've made my point that a lot of people would not honestly tell the government who they had personal contact with, who they could have spread Ebola to. People in America are just as likely to lie about who they've been in contact with as people in Africa are. People in America are just as likely to not trust the government about Ebola as people in Africa. I've told people in America about Ebola and they've said that whole thing is made up. People in America are just as likely to deny that Ebola even exists as people in Africa. Oh, and then there's the thing the guy said, let me see if I can find it online. This one guy said that people in Africa, Ebola spreads in Africa because people there all eat food with their bare hands off the same plate, and they go to the bathroom in unclean toilets with improper sanitation.
The question is there real conclusive data about what exactly Ebola is and what exactly that it is in the human body?
I was listening to Ebola in 2006.
I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. All I'm saying is that is there any conclusive data actually showing exactly what it does, how it does, and where it does it?
Fucking Ebola since '97.
I'm pretty sure there is.
I feel like if I, yeah.
Wow.
I haven't had
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
I've had like what?
Shall we search? Because I tried to find some data that actually shows the entire essence and the whole spectrum
Wait,
of what it
what
actually
did I say?
is.
97?
The Ebola virus.
I'm just gonna fly a giant sign tomorrow that says
Let's look at Wikipedia. I like Wikipedia. Do you like Wikipedia?
Yeah, yours looks like
What?
Wikipedia.
Let's get Ebola.
It was discovered in 1976. I remember seeing a TV show about it when I was a little kid on one of the science channels.
Tyler with the skirt, cheerleading outfit, and like some fucking pigtails.
It's named after the Ebola River in the Democratic Republic of Congo,
Some blood.
previously Zaire.
You had to put that in your
And it's a virus. Most people don't even understand what the difference is between a bacteria and a virus.
It's Professor Adrienne Floreen.
Here's a little science lesson about the difference between viruses and bacteria and other laws of science. Bacteria and viruses are both single-celled organisms. Bacteria reproduce on their own and are 100% alive. Viruses copy their DNA into your DNA, using your cell to replicate themselves. When your cells are done assembling the viral molecules, your body then sheds the virus, which means that molecules of the virus are released into the environment, meaning that you're contagious. They may or may not meet the scientific definition of life, meaning that viruses may not actually be alive. The Ebola virus is 970 nanometers to 1400 nanometers long, which makes it unusual for viruses because it's almost as big as a bacteria, like E. coli, which is 1000 nanometers long and 300 nanometers wide. In comparison, the smallpox virus is 300 nanometers long and 200 nanometers wide, and enterovirus is 30 nanometers wide. This is part of the reason that it's hard for your body to fight Ebola off. It takes a lot of energy for your cells to replicate that much viral DNA. Since your own cells copy the virus, it uses up a lot of energy. Therefore, eating a lot of food with a lot of vitamins and calories can help you recover from viral infections. But there's another law of science that applies here. Murphy's Law, which is paraphrased up here. For those of you who don't know, Murphy's Law is anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Many people have paraphrased it. A few of the quotes are permanently written on my bulletin board because something always seems to go wrong. I'd also like to point out that there's a lot of evidence that many cancers are actually caused by viruses, which can cause unrepairable damage to your DNA if your cell survives the process of copying the virus. This can lead to cancer, so one of my predictions is some of the people who survive Ebola might get cancer. It should be against the law for secretaries or nurses or doctors to lick their finger and then use their spit-on finger to separate pieces of paper that are stuck together. Because passing a law like that would help prevent the spread of Ebola.
Nice.
I was about to tell my story about the swine flu.
Oh, damn.
Oh, can I raise you?
A few years ago, I went to the doctor's office, and it was around the time that the swine flu was coming out. And as I was going into the doctor's office, there was a sign on the door, and it said, "Wash your hands after touching your nose or mouth to avoid spreading diseases like the swine flu."
Oh, it works.
So I went to the doctor's office and I had to fill out a form. And the secretary handed me a piece of paper. The pieces of paper in the stack were stuck together, and the secretary licked her finger and used her licked finger to pull the pieces of paper apart and give me a form. So what did I do? Well, I said, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to ask you to wash your hands because I don't want to be exposed to the swine flu. I was like, I'm sorry, but since you licked your finger and then you touched that piece of paper, I'm going to have to ask you to give me a new piece of paper, and I'm going to have to ask you to wash your hands because I don't want to be exposed to diseases like the swine flu. And she was like, I'm not sick. And I was like, well, for a lot of colds and viruses, you can be contagious before you're sick, so I'm going to have to ask you to wash your hands. And she got really offended. Really, really offended. But this is the office person in a doctor's office. The lady at the front desk at a doctor's office should not be licking her finger and then touching the form because if she is sick, she'll expose everyone else.
Yeah.
It's the spitting secretaries spreading swine flu. Spitting secretaries spread swine flu. And Ebola. A lot of people have an attitude about just being sick that's kind of like a nonchalant attitude. They're like, oh, you're sick, I'm not worried, I won't catch it, I rarely get sick. Or they say, oh, you're sick, I'm sick too, we can hang out and smoke out of the pipe together because we're both sick. So they sneeze into their hand, and then they touch the doorknob. All of these things are a problem with Ebola.
Yeah, or anything, really. People are ignorant about it.
Yeah, but they're
And
more
they
of a
don't
problem
really
with
care past
Ebola.
themselves. If they're already sick, they don't really care past that.
I doubt that, like, at a
27
men's
lives
public
with no creatures
restroom
on
in,
the
like,
field.
any of the rest
I think
areas
I'm playing
we
with
went to
them.
across the country,
Oh.
only, like, maybe 1 out of 20 men wash their hands longer than 10 seconds.
Oh, I'd like to make a good
Probably
point.
longer than 5 seconds.
That brings me to
Longer
a good
than
point.
5 seconds.
Most people believe that urine is
90%
sterile.
of them don't use water, too. I mean, not water, but soap.
That's because most people believe that urine is sterile. Ebola is one of the things that can be spread through urine.
Phoenix leader.
Like, I don't think you can give someone the flu by peeing on them if you have the flu. But you can give someone Ebola. So, would you like to hear my dire predictions about Ebola?
I thought you were going to say your diarrhea, but yeah.
You could say it causes diarrhea. I predict that it's at least a possibility that Ebola might spread as quickly in Texas, or quicker, than it did in Africa. I predict that if a nurse in Spain got Ebola, that it's a real possibility that a nurse or a doctor in America might get Ebola while treating a patient. I predict that they're going to find out that he probably knew he had Ebola when he came to America. When he got off the airplane, he was not yet contagious, meaning he was not yet shedding the virus, but he knew that he was infected. And I predict that he's probably going to die. These are my dire predictions. I'm sorry that they're so dire. I don't like predicting that people are going to die, but...
Wait, you wrote that up right now?
But why would I make such dire predictions? Well, this is how I see it. First they said that the Ebola outbreak was going to be contained to a few hundred people. Then they said it was going to be contained within a few countries in Africa. Then they said it was possibly going to spread to the US or to Europe, but it was going to be contained once it got there. Then it spread to the US and to Europe, and it somehow got loose. A hospital in America, where all the hospitals were supposed to be so prepared and so sanitary, managed to miss a case of Ebola. And they let a patient get out to possibly infect school children and homeless people. Both groups of people who are likely to spread disease. They told us that doctors at hospitals in America and Europe knew how to handle Ebola patients. They said it was very unlikely that healthcare workers in America or Europe would catch Ebola, but a nurse in Spain still managed to catch it. That's why I predict that doctors and nurses in America will catch it. And doctors in America don't always wash their hands. Here I found an article online about a hospital in New York that did a study on gloves. They had nurses watch other nurses and doctors, and they realized that thousands of times a day, they either forgot to wear gloves, didn't wash their hands properly, or took the gloves off in a way that could contaminate their hands with bacteria. And like the other webpage said, it's very likely that some of these doctors and nurses catching Ebola are getting it when they're removing their protective gear and accidentally contaminating themselves as they do it. All hospitals should have a program like that to make sure that doctors and nurses always wear gloves and wash their hands properly. And first they said the outbreak wasn't out of control, and then they said it was. And anyone who tried to warn us that this outbreak was going to get worse was shamed and accused of fear-mongering, whether they were a scientist or a conspiracy theorist. I was afraid to make a video with my predictions about Ebola because I was afraid of being accused of being a conspiracy theorist. But once my predictions were right, over and over and over, I finally decided that I had to make a video and talk about it. And they keep telling us, don't panic, don't panic, don't panic. It's not going to happen, it's not going to happen, it's not going to happen. And then the very next day, when you read the news online, it's happened. And this has happened over and over and over. Every day I read the news, and I see these, don't panic, it's not going to happen type of warnings. And I tell my friends and my family, it's going to happen. The very next day I read the news and I'm right. And that's why I'm making this video. Here's an article that talks about how, in Africa, families and neighbors eat off the same plate with their bare hands. And here's an article that talks about the bathrooms in Liberia, and how many people share the same bathroom, and how bad the sanitary conditions are. And what they're trying to say is that Ebola would not spread in America because people in America don't eat off the same plate with their bare hands, and because we have proper sanitation in our bathrooms. Or do we? Last month, I went to a Fish concert in Colorado. Let's look at some of the pictures from that concert. In this picture, you can see 3 people eating salad off of a plate with their bare hands that another person previously used to eat a slice of pizza. And here's a picture of the inside of one of the porta potties. Hopefully my point's been made here. Americans sometimes eat food off of the same plate with their bare hands, and they sometimes use bathrooms with improper sanitation. I hear that a member of the film crew in Africa has Ebola. A member of the NBC film crew. Now, I saw the video that he filmed where they went into the Ebola treatment ward, and I wondered something. How did they sterilize the video camera? Could he have gotten Ebola from the video camera?
Possibly. I don't see why not.
I think so. I think it's a real possibility.
I mean, there really isn't that much information on it, so...
And when they say it's not an airborne virus, people don't understand that if you sneeze, microscopic particles can travel a long distance through the air. So while Ebola isn't an airborne virus because it doesn't float around and live in the air for days, it can still travel through the air for a really long distance. That's one of the things they're not telling you. Or they're telling you, but they're not making a point to emphasize it. And they really should. Basically, what they're not telling you is, even though it's not airborne, it might as well be. And the Ebola virus can live on surfaces for days. And it comes out in your sweat. If you touch something while you're sweating, that object is now contaminated. I'm also concerned that the government is going to use this Ebola outbreak to force people to take experimental drugs or vaccines that they don't want to take. I'm going to get some vaccines for my son, but I don't want him to have all the vaccines. And as a parent, that should be my choice. Nobody should be forced to take medication they don't want to take, or to have a vaccine that they don't want to take. And that's the problem. When the government starts to force people into quarantine, some people are going to run and hide, and that can spread Ebola. And that's why laws that make drugs illegal and laws that make prostitution illegal are bad, because they make people afraid of the government. And nobody should be afraid of the government. The government and the police and the army should be here to protect us. But are they? That's the question a lot of people ask themselves, which is why they don't trust the government. Because of incidents like what happened in Ferguson, or when the police beat me up in Petaluma a few years ago. Here's another one of my cats. This is Taylor. We call him Taylor because his tail is crooked. As you can see, he also has the same sinus and eye infection. First one cat got sick, then another one, and then a few more. If I'd had the first one tested to see what virus or bacteria was making it sick, then maybe they could have treated it before the next one got it. Instead, they gave me a broad-spectrum antibiotic that kills some bacteria, but not all of the things that could cause this. It didn't work, and because of that, the rest of my cats got sick. And that brings me to another one of my recommendations. Every time somebody gets sick, they should test them to see what's making them sick. What specific virus or bacteria is making them sick? Instead of just giving them antibiotics. It would stop a lot of the overuse of antibiotics that creates antibiotic-resistant drugs, and it would allow the government to keep track of diseases, such as the swine flu, enterovirus, or Ebola, diseases which are highly contagious, and maybe the government could stop them before they became epidemics. And wouldn't you just like to know what specific virus or bacteria was making you sick when you were sick? I would. And if they did that, it would help to diagnose a lot of undiagnosed cases of difficult to diagnose diseases such as Lyme disease, or rare diseases that often go undiagnosed for years, but might still be contagious. And blowing your nose into a tissue, the way a normal person does, might not be enough to stop the spread of Ebola. But this Ebola outbreak is a really good example of why Obamacare is a good idea. If everybody on the earth had health insurance and access to proper modern medical care, the Ebola outbreak either never would have happened or never would have spread. And a lot of the people who died probably could have been saved. Everybody should have health insurance, or something that gives them access to proper medical care. When I first saw the news story about Ebola in March, I said to myself, this is bad news. This could destroy civilization on Earth. Hopefully I'm not right about that dire prediction, but I could be. And that's why you should listen to me, because my dire predictions have been right too many times. I'm not saying I can see the future or anything, because I certainly can't. I just seem to be able to put two and two together, more than your average Joe, or maybe more than the people who write the news articles. So my advice to you is, stock up on rubber gloves, and bleach, and medical supplies, to prepare for the upcoming Ebola outbreak in America, just in case there is one. And although the government's made it illegal to promote any herbal remedy as a cure for Ebola, I'm reading about this herb online called yarrow that not only lowers fevers, but causes blood clotting, which could stop bleeding. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Adrienne Floreen Comments on the News. If you like this video, please watch my other videos on YouTube.